A teenage immigrant came to the United States to realize her dream of becoming a doctor. But a tragic twist of fate intervened when she found herself an innocent victim of the drug trade. Kidnapped and held captive, she survived for days against all odds. Authorities arrested her captors, but they refused to reveal her whereabouts. The FBI and local police raced against time, determined to save the teenager's life.
When a young woman was grabbed from her Texas home, the police raced to find her abductors. On the face of it, the kidnapping seemed like the random act of desperate men. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Before the FBI could find her, they first had to find a motive. Their investigation revealed a complex story of betrayal and revenge. At its center stood an innocent 16-year-old who found herself in the clutches of killers.
September 24th, 1994, Arlington, Texas. It was a Saturday night, and 16-year-old Lisa Rene was home studying. She wanted to make the most of her first semester in an American high school. She hoped to someday return to the Virgin Islands as a surgeon.
Who is it?
At 8 p.m., her concentration was suddenly shattered. Somehow, she knew not to answer the door. Instead, she called her sister Pearl.
What do you want?
Pearl told Lisa to call 911. She promised to come right home.
Arlington 911, what are you reporting? Who do they say that they're looking for?
Lisa said men were trying to break into her house, men who claimed to be FBI agents.
You have the wrong house. I'm sorry. Oh, they're the FBI. They're the FBI. They said that. What's going on?
The dispatcher heard the phone drop.
What's going on? Ma'am.
Then there was silence. Lisa never came back on the line. As Arlington, Texas police responded to the 911 call, Lisa disappeared into the night. The police had no way of knowing they were about to pass her on the street, or that a 16-year-old girl was now in mortal danger. Police were on the scene with Lisa's sister Pearl when Detective John Stanton arrived. As a veteran of the Arlington police force, he would lead the investigation.
From the initial 911 call, it sounded like a very serious kidnapping. It sounded to the 911 call takers that there was some foul play and some actual violence involved.
The detective needed to know everything, and quickly. The early hours of a kidnapping case are crucial. Pearl told the officers all she knew. She was at work when her sister Lisa called to say some men were trying to break into the apartment. She told Lisa to call 911, then hurried home. But she was too late. She found the sliding glass door smashed and Lisa gone.
For a 16-year-old to be physically dragged from a residence in Arlington is just, it's really kind of unspeakable.
Okay, now whose room is this?
Pearl told the detectives that her brothers, Neil and Stanfield, were also staying with her. They had been evicted from their own apartment for allegedly selling drugs.
So they don't have their own room.
Pearl explained that her family was from the U.S. Virgin Islands. She and her brothers had come to America first.
It's right here.
Lisa had joined them in time to start school.
We have to find her.
She was a straight-A student. Investigators processed the apartment, hoping to find a clue as to the abductors' identities. They found no prints far into the apartment. Perhaps the abductors were known to the family. The detective asked to talk to Pearl's brothers, but they were on their way back from a Houston music festival.
What's going on?
The detective told Pearl to get them on the cell phone.
I'm not saying that you had anything to do with what I'm asking you. Come over.
They were 50 miles from the apartment when Detective Stanton reached them.
I understand what you're saying.
When I spoke to the brothers, I spoke with Stanfield initially. Stanfield told me that they don't know of anyone who would have wanted to abduct their sister. They owed no one money, that this was not about any sort of drug business. They weren't involved in anything involving drugs.
All right.
As much as Pearl Rene tried to help, the detective believed her brothers had the answers he was looking for. But without their help, he would have to identify Lisa's captors the hard way. As precious minutes slipped by, forensic technicians combed the apartment for additional clues. They collected glass from the broken sliding door and hair and fiber samples.
Also got books.
They dusted for fingerprints, only to conclude that the kidnappers had worn gloves. Even this small detail worried detectives. It suggested Lisa Rene was in the hands of experienced criminals. If Detective Stanton ever hoped to find Lisa alive, he knew he needed all the help he could get.
You have to use the resources available to you, and that includes additional manpower, the use of the FBI. You have to use everything that you have as a resource.
Special agents from the FBI's Fort Worth resident agency joined detectives at the scene. Special Agent Kenneth Bersano was concerned that the kidnappers had identified themselves as FBI agents.
As it turned out, there was no FBI agent there on the scene or any other joint investigation ongoing in that neighborhood.
Neighbors reported seeing 4 young African-American men hanging around the apartment complex prior to the abduction. They were wearing camouflage clothing and driving a champagne-colored Cadillac.
The atmosphere at the crime scene was tense. Lisa Rene's sister was very distraught that she wasn't there for her sister, and also residents in the complex were disturbed that a young lady could be abducted from an apartment complex so readily.
The fact that Lisa Rene was a minor and that her abductors had impersonated federal agents gave the FBI jurisdiction over the case. They would work in conjunction with local law enforcement.
Homicide, Stanton.
Detective Stanton worked through the night and into the morning.
Yeah, what's going on?
In the early hours of September 25th, he received a call from Lisa's brothers. They had found the champagne-colored Cadillac in nearby Irving, the same one residents had described at the complex.
It was an unusual tip for the brothers to have just barely gotten into Arlington, to have had them drive mysteriously to a residence in Irving, Texas, which is some distance from Arlington, and in that same bit of circumstance find a Cadillac fitting that general description, we thought was very curious.
They reported that the Cadillac was parked in front of a residence. If Lisa's brothers knew something more about their sister's abduction, they weren't telling police. Detective Stanton and Special Agent Bersano rushed to the residence in Irving.
Car here, then I spotted, and
Irving police were already there. The sooner they found out where Lisa was being held, the better their chance of finding her alive. As Lisa's brothers had said, the Cadillac was parked out front.
I got a cold hood.
We touched the vehicle to see if the vehicle had been moved or had been in operation previously from the heat on the hood. We also looked inside the vehicle with our flashlights to see if there were any items that may have been left by the victim.
A woman answered the door.
We explained why we were there, that we were from the Arlington Police Department, from the FBI. We would like to talk to her about the abduction of a young 16-year-old girl. We asked if we may just look around her home to see if the young lady that was abducted was in there.
The woman said she and her husband owned the Cadillac, but he wasn't home since he worked the night shift. She said she hadn't seen anyone who matched the description of the suspects. But she let investigators take a quick look around. They began in a child's room where her son was asleep. Nothing seemed suspicious. In another room, they awakened a woman sleeping in a double bed.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning.
It appeared she was alone.
Talking to Sandra, she told us we would look around. We're looking for somebody. Just sit tight.
In the hallway, investigators noticed stairs to an attic. One of the Irving officers climbed up and looked around.
There's a light up here.
He checked amidst the boxes and other items, but saw no one there.
I don't see anything up here.
We didn't have a real just cause to do an intensive search of the residence. We searched for, obviously, any sign that someone had been kidnapped, in places where someone could secrete a human body, just to be on the safe side.
Investigators left, still suspicious. But without a warrant, they were unable to do a more thorough search. Investigators turned their attention back to Lisa's brothers, Neil and Stanfield.
We felt that it was drug-related, and we told Neil and Stanfield that we're not interested in their current legal problems, but that we feel like Lisa's life may be at stake and that we need to have all the information that they can provide us to help get their sister back.
The day after the kidnapping, investigators again interviewed Neil and Stanfield. Despite their pending drug charges, Lisa's brothers finally came clean. They described a bogus drug deal that they'd taken part in a few days before.
What's up, man?
The brothers said that they had met with 2 men, but claimed they only knew the one named Steve.
9 pounds, right? Yeah.
Steve and his partner had given them $5,000 to score 9 pounds of marijuana.
How long will it take?
Neil and Stanfield promised they would return in an hour with the drugs, but they never
45
did.
minutes, right?
They now admitted they had never intended to deliver the marijuana. They just needed the money for attorney's fees because of their pending drug charges. Lisa's brothers said they didn't know how to contact Steve, but they knew someone who did. And that was all the brothers would say. The man who knew Steve was an inmate serving an 8-year sentence at the Tarrant County Jail. He revealed that Steve's full name was Stephen Beckley, a 19-year-old who worked detailing cars at a dealership in Irving, Texas.
West Wing Auto Shop, where's that at?
Investigators ran a computer check on Beckley. He had no outstanding warrants and no criminal history. As investigators continued to work the case, Lisa's sister, Pearl, did all she could to help. She hung up missing persons flyers and contacted local media, hoping someone might have seen Lisa. But the chance of finding her sister alive grew dimmer with each passing day. On September 24th, 1994, 16-year-old Lisa Rene was kidnapped from her Arlington, Texas apartment.
Who you want to? Who are you? I'm the FBI. Oh, they're the FBI. Open the door. No, we talk. They're the FBI. They say they're the FBI, ma'am. No! Ma'am, what's going on? Ma'am.
Just over 2 days had passed since Lisa's desperate call for help. Local police and the FBI were no closer to finding the missing girl. With time running out, the Arlington Police Department asked the public for help. Detective Stanton recalls the response was tremendous.
It was truly something that brought out the public and the public's fears about being abducted out of your own residence. It's sort of something that you're not expecting in a community like Arlington. It's not something that's ordinary. This doesn't happen here, I would say, ever in a town like ours.
On September 27th, the Arlington police detective received an unexpected visitor. He was the owner of the Irving, Texas home that police had searched in connection with the champagne-colored Cadillac. He was at work during the search, but had since heard the news of Lisa's disappearance and believed he had information that might be helpful. He said that the day before the kidnapping, he threw a barbecue since his wife's brothers were staying with him for a few days. The oldest brother, Orlando Hall, was involved with drugs. His younger brother, Demetrius Hall, shared the same interest. Their friend, Stephen Beckley, joined them.
When the husband told us that the Hall brothers were dressed in camouflage clothing, it made him know that after having heard the news stories, his brothers-in-law could very well be connected to the kidnapping case.
Something else had sparked the man's suspicions. One of his neighbors said she saw several young men drive up to the house in his Cadillac. At that time, he and his wife were out for dinner using a different car. But the Cadillac's keys were kept in the hall, so it was possible his wife's brothers had borrowed it. The man said he'd never trusted the Hall brothers.
Come here, you.
Both had served time in Arkansas on drug charges.
Come here, son. Come here. Come here.
And by visiting their sister in Irving, Texas, they were in violation of their
No,
parole.
you ain't like that. Put it out. Whatever's right.
The man sensed they were up to something new, but didn't know what. He added that the Hall brothers were no longer staying at his house. On the night of the kidnapping, only Orlando had slept in the house, but he flew back to Arkansas early the next morning, planning to stay with friends in the town of El Dorado. The detective suspected Orlando had probably joined the others there. He contacted the El Dorado, Arkansas police. Investigators discovered that 19-year-old Demetrius Hall was on parole for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. His older brother, Orlando Hall, was on parole for the same offense. His record also included arrests for aggravated assault and carrying a weapon.
When I spoke to the people in El Dorado, they were aware of the Hall family. In fact, they were providing to me information about the Hall brothers before I could even give them the information about the Hall brothers. They were well known to law enforcement in the community.
Later that day, investigators obtained a warrant to more thoroughly search the Irving, Texas home where the Hall brothers had been staying. They scoured the house for hair, fibers, blood, fingerprints, and anything else that might be connected to the crime. FBI Special Agent Garrett Floyd remembers their most significant discovery.
In the children's room, we found a souvenir miniature baseball bat. When you pick up an item and you can see glass embedded in it, and you know that the sliding pane window was glass, then you make a decision on the spot, and you believe that evidence is a part of the crime scene.
Lab tests would determine whether his hunch was correct. In a storage container found in a bedroom closet, investigators discovered a green knit shirt with insulation fibers on it. They bagged it for further analysis. They also took samples of insulation fibers from the attic. Lab tests would later reveal that they matched the fibers on the shirt. A pair of camouflage pants was also found in the attic. Forensic technicians processed the champagne-colored Cadillac at the police impound lot. They found no fingerprints relevant to the case. They did discover a few small glass fragments inside the car, possibly from Lisa's sliding glass door. They sent the fragments to the lab for analysis. As they waited for the results, agents obtained arrest warrants for the Hall brothers and their friend Stephen Beckley, since they already had enough to establish probable cause. But they still hadn't found Lisa Rene. Agent Floyd continued to work around the clock, knowing that with each hour, they were less likely to find her alive.
We were very motivated in solving this case, in as much that we knew that time was critical. All of our efforts were focused on the recovery of the victim.
Investigators hoped they could pick up Lisa's trail, a trail that ended with broken glass. Technicians compared glass fragments from the car and those embedded in the baseball bat to shards collected from Lisa's home. At the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., Supervisory Special Agent and Forensic Examiner Bruce Hall attempted to confirm that all the glass had come from the same sliding glass door. Technicians examined the glass embedded in the baseball bat. They tested the composition of the glass. It was consistent with the glass collected at Lisa's apartment. To confirm their results, they also tested its refractive index, the degree to which light bends as it passes through the sample.
After characterizing the glass recovered from the crime scene and characterizing the glass recovered from the baseball bat, I found that the glass on the baseball bat had the same refractive index and same composition as the glass at the crime scene. That led me to the conclusion that the glass on the baseball bat had originated from the crime scene.
The glass found in the Cadillac did not match. It was determined to have come from a window previously broken on the car. At the request of the FBI and Arlington, Texas police, El Dorado, Arkansas detectives tracked down the fugitives. They found 19-year-old Demetrius Hall at his father's house in El Dorado. He surrendered peacefully and was taken to the El Dorado jail. But he refused to say anything about Lisa's whereabouts. The search of the house revealed nothing. What investigators still didn't know was where Lisa was and whether she was dead or alive. 4.5 days after 16-year-old Lisa Rene was kidnapped from her sister's apartment in Arlington, Texas, investigators had tracked her abductors to El Dorado, Arkansas. One of the 3 suspects, Demetrius Hall, was in custody. Investigators continued to search for his older brother, Orlando, and a third man named Stephen Beckley. That afternoon, police found Stephen Beckley at a friend's house. The officers didn't even have to knock. Beckley came out and gave himself up. FBI agents and detectives from Arlington flew to El Dorado to interview the suspects. Stephen Beckley was initially uncooperative. He refused to say where Lisa Rene was or whether she was still alive.
I'm losing my patience with you right now.
Special Agent Garrett Floyd refused to give up.
Mr. Beckley advised that he did not know a whole lot of information concerning what was going on. After about an hour of talking to him, he looked at me and we developed somewhat of a relationship and we started to talk.
Beckley said that he and his friends had called in a fourth man named Bruce Webster to help them exact their revenge on Lisa Rene's brothers. Webster was a convicted felon and had a violent reputation as a hitman. Their plan was to douse Lisa Rene's brothers in gasoline and ignite it if they didn't turn over the drugs or the money as they had promised. When the men arrived at Lisa Rene's apartment, her brothers were not home. Unwilling to leave empty-handed, they kidnapped her instead. Beckley said that he and the other three took Lisa to the house in Irving, Texas, where Demetrius and Orlando were staying. They transferred the teenage girl from the Cadillac to Beckley's Ford Escort.
Get off the car.
Stephen Beckley, Bruce Webster, and 19-year-old Demetrius Hall drove her to Arkansas. Orlando Hall stayed behind and hid in his sister's attic. Detective Stanton was frustrated. Police had been within a few feet of Orlando Hall and missed him.
It wasn't until later that we learned, after we had taken some people into custody, that Orlando had been indeed hiding in the attic insulation while we were downstairs talking to the lady of the house.
Beckley said that during the 4-hour drive to Arkansas, he and the other two had taken turns raping Lisa Rene. When they arrived in Arkansas that night, Webster booked a motel room in Pine Bluff. Lisa was kept bound and gagged in the bathroom.
I'm trying to find her.
Agents pushed Beckley to tell them if the girl was still alive and where she was. Every minute counted if they were to save her life. But Beckley wouldn't say. He claimed he was afraid to talk as long as Bruce Webster was on the loose.
In his mind, he thought, believed, knew that Bruce Webster would kill him or anyone else if they ever divulged the information of what had occurred to Lisa Rene. That's the fear that Bruce Webster had instilled in the individuals as part of his kidnapping.
If I say a word,
Beckley did tell investigators where to look for Webster. The ex-convict might still be at the motel in Pine Bluff where they had held Lisa Rene 4 days ago. Investigators headed to the motel to confront a man Beckley had described as a violent hitman. Pine Bluff was 90 miles from El Dorado. Agents spoke with the manager to confirm Beckley's story. They hoped they would find Webster there, as well as Lisa Rene.
Upon interviewing the innkeeper, we were able to determine that Bruce Webster had registered at that inn, and that during the time he was registering, a young lady attempted to get out of the car, and that Bruce turned to the other occupants in the car and says, "Put the bitch back in the car." Bruce Webster and his companions then drove to the back of the property and went into the room.
The manager also remembered seeing 2 other black males in the car, but she couldn't make out their faces. She showed investigators the registration log for September 25th. Webster had been in room 513. The room was rented and cleaned several times after the men checked out. Chances of finding any useful evidence were slim. An FBI emergency response team was called in. The agent and detective continued to interview Beckley. They asked him for details of what went on in the room, hoping he would break down and tell them where Lisa was now.
Once we got Mr. Beckley to this Pine Bluff motel, the urgency was there in that we thought that she was still alive because Mr. Beckley assured us the last time he saw her, she was alive and she was at this inn.
Okay.
Beckley told police that the men had raped Lisa repeatedly in the bathroom. Otherwise, they had kept her hooded with a paper bag over her head. During their second night at the motel, the kidnappers were nearly discovered. A security guard knocked at the door.
The innkeeper asked that their on-residence security guard who lived there check the room to see if everything was all right. The security guard did check the room and did not see Lisa Rene within the room. Stephen Beckley advised that had he seen her, that they were going to kill the security guard.
Beckley and the others were afraid that the guard might return. The motel was no longer a safe place to hide. As the kidnapper told his story, forensic technicians worked to confirm that Lisa had in fact been in the room. But after hours of painstaking work, they still had no evidence that Lisa had been there or that she was still alive. 6 days after 16-year-old Lisa Rene was kidnapped from her Arlington, Texas apartment, the FBI was no closer to finding her or two remaining suspects. Although investigators had found no evidence to indicate that Lisa had been in a Pine Bluff motel room, confessed kidnapper Stephen Beckley assured them she had. Forensic technician Joel Stevenson of the Arlington, Texas Police Department was determined to find something that would corroborate Beckley's story.
We went in knowing that possibly sexual assaults had occurred in that motel room, multiple sexual assaults. We went into the motel room looking for body fluids that may tie the suspects to the motel room or Lisa to the motel room.
If Lisa and her kidnappers had left behind any evidence, it appeared to have been destroyed by the motel's housekeepers. The technicians didn't give up. They continued their meticulous search for hairs, fibers, and fingerprints. Finally, their persistence paid off.
It wasn't until we got into the bathroom and the wall behind the toilet is where we located the palm prints and fingerprints that were ultimately identified as belonging to Lisa Rene. So the palm print itself, placing Lisa with them in that same motel room, was very important. It was a very critical piece of putting her with them.
Investigators now had evidence that Lisa was alive 4 days earlier, the day Beckley and the others had checked in. As agents drove the kidnapper 90 miles back to the El Dorado jail, they pressed Beckley for more details. He admitted that after Orlando Hall had joined them in Pine Bluff, they decided to move Lisa to another motel nearby in order to avoid a second visit by the security guard. After a couple of days in that motel, the men grew increasingly concerned about getting caught. They came up with a plan to dispose of the girl. Demetrius Hall stayed behind to wipe the room clean, while the other three loaded her into Webster's car and headed for a rural area. Beckley told investigators that Bruce Webster and Orlando Hall had dug a grave in a nature preserve near the motel. They took Lisa there to kill her. But in the dark, overgrown park, the three men couldn't find the burial site. After an hour, they took her back to the motel. The next morning, they searched for the gravesite again. While forensic technicians scoured the second motel room for clues, investigators pressured Beckley to tell them what happened next. Special Agent Garrett Floyd recalls that Beckley refused, still afraid that Webster might seek retribution.
We were pressed for time because the clock was still ticking. We were hoping against hope that she was still alive. And so with this in mind, agents as well as police officers who had not slept in 2 or 3 days were up searching, looking, hoping that she was still alive.
Then, investigators got the call they'd been hoping for. The FBI emergency response team, working at the second motel, had spotted Bruce Webster pull up in his car. The suspected kidnapper had returned to the motel with a young woman, but she was not Lisa Rene. A brief interview revealed she was not connected to the crime in any way.
You're not in any trouble. It's gonna be okay, okay? Just let me call him.
He had driven up into the parking lot. Our officers and the FBI agents confronted him. He identified himself as Bruce Webster, gave date of birth information. He was carrying a small baggie of what appeared to be marijuana in his pocket. He was asked if we could search his vehicle. He allowed the officers to search his vehicle that he'd driven up in.
Inside the vehicle, agents found 2 handguns. They charged Webster with possession of the guns and the marijuana and took him to the Garland County Jail in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The car was processed for other evidence. They found no trace of the missing girl.
And when they radioed us and told us he was in custody, we, myself, and Detective Ford went back and interviewed Bruce Webster. He stated that he didn't know anything. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply coming back to his motel room.
As Agent Floyd continued to pressure Webster for answers, the last of the fugitives, Orlando Hall, turned himself in.
Orlando Hall had apparently seen the news that these arrests had been made, found out, of course, that his brother had been taken into custody. He surrendered to the Pine Bluff Police Department.
With all 4 suspects now in custody, agents hoped that one of them would reveal where investigators could find Lisa Rene. The interview with Bruce Webster, the man who had been hired to do the killing, continued into the night, but he said little. Agent Floyd believed Webster had the answers they were looking for.
Basically, the only information Mr. Webster provided was his name, the fact that he hadn't done anything, and the fact that he wanted to go to sleep. To him, it was nothing. She was nothing.
Agents' hope of finding Lisa alive was fading. They needed to get one of the suspects to talk, and they needed to do it fast. Six days after a young woman was abducted from her Arlington, Texas apartment, investigators pressed her suspected kidnappers for information. Until now, alleged hitman Bruce Webster had stonewalled investigators. But Special Agent Garrett Floyd's persistence eventually paid off. Webster finally admitted that Lisa was dead.
It felt like a tremendous sledgehammer falling on you. We had tracked this young lady from Arlington, Texas to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, over 200 miles, with the one hope of finding her alive. And we did not. It was as if all of the wind and all of the energy had gone out of us.
Webster picked up the story where his accomplice Stephen Beckley left off. When they returned to the park with Lisa, they located the grave they had dug the day before. Detective John Stanton's fears had been realized.
The reality of it set in at that point that we were not going to find her alive. We were not going to be able to save her. We were going to be too late.
Stand by the car. Watch
Webster said that only 2 of his accomplices, Orlando Hall and Stephen Beckley, took Lisa back to the park. The 4th kidnapper, Demetrius Hall, had stayed behind to clean the motel room and wipe away fingerprints. The suspected hitman claimed he wasn't actually with the others when they killed the girl. Webster said he returned to the car to act as the lookout. From the car, the grave was too far away to have seen the murder. Now that Webster was safely in custody, the agents decided to see if Beckley would corroborate his story. Agent Floyd felt that Beckley knew far more than he had said.
And he looked at me and he said, "You know I didn't tell you everything. You know I've lied." And I said, "Yes, I know you did not tell me everything. You didn't lie, but you didn't tell me everything." And he said, "You're right." So then Stephen Beckley started crying. And Stephen Beckley told me she was dead, that she was buried in these woods, and that we needed to go get her. And I said, "We will go get her. Let's get your story on paper, and we will go and find her."
Crazy, man. He's a hitman.
Beckley said that despite Bruce Webster's story, the hitman had indeed been involved in the killing.
He told us a story that the grave was 6 foot deep, and that when she went to the grave, when she, Bruce Webster, Orlando Hall, and he, Stephen Beckley, arrived at the grave, that she saw the grave, and that she started to run in the effort to get away. And that they struck at her with a shovel and placed a mark in this tree. That he, Beckley, became concerned and was afraid and ran back up to the street to check to see if the way was clear, as he was instructed to by Bruce Webster. By the time he came back, they were burying her.
What you asked for?
Beckley told investigators that the men then met Demetrius back at the motel, showered, and left. They gave their dirty clothes to Webster, who burned them in the park, along with Lisa's blood-stained outfit. Webster stayed in Pine Bluff with Orlando Hall, while the other two returned to El Dorado. The agent re-interviewed Webster, hoping Beckley's confession would give him some leverage. The agent told him that Beckley had placed him at the murder scene and named the park where the body was buried.
He stated that he didn't know anything about anything. The last thing that I told him was, "Everyone else has told me what has occurred. Why won't you?" And he said, "They're family, aren't they?" And I said, "Yep, the family has turned on you." He said, "Open that book. Let me tell you what happened."
The hitman now confessed that he was, in fact, at the murder scene. He admitted that he had dug the grave, and he offered to show it to the agent.
So in the middle of the night, we drove back to Pine Bluff and told him I need as many flashlights and officers and agents available, that we were going to find her tonight.
Webster showed investigators the area of the park where the body was buried. They searched for evidence to corroborate the suspect's stories. By morning, they found the gravesite. They began to process the area and exhume the body. The site was as the hitman had described it, right down to a damaged tree near the grave.
And we removed a section of that tree because it was evidence that the shovel that they were hitting her with had actually missed on one of their swings and hit the tree. So we used that tree as a part of the evidence.
Unearthing the body was a time-consuming and heartbreaking process. Besides digging, investigators sifted through leaves and dirt, searching for anything that might help tie the suspects to the crime. Joel Stevenson of the Arlington, Texas Police recalls the moment when their hard work finally paid off.
We made contact with Lisa's body approximately 2 feet down from the surface, the outer surface of the dirt, and then started uncovering her and really excavating around the body from that point on down to the 4 feet level. This lasted for about 5.5 hours. It took us to fully extract her from the gravesite.
When they reached the dead woman's body, it was an emotional moment for investigators who wanted so desperately to save Lisa Rene.
During the time we were exhuming her body, one of the agents on the evidence response team accidentally scrapes her knee. The agent breaks down, and I break down, because we know now that she's dead. This week that we have spent trying to locate her has resulted in the recovery of her, but not the recovery of her in that she was not alive.
The coroner removed Lisa's body to the Arkansas State Lab in Little Rock, where an autopsy was performed. She had ligature marks on her arms, defensive wounds on her hands, bruises over much of her body, and deep lacerations to the back of her head. But the cause of death was determined to be suffocation, coupled with blunt force trauma to the head. The coroner believed Lisa's attackers knocked her unconscious with a shovel and then buried her alive.
When you find out that you were that close to possibly saving this kidnapped victim from her demise, as it turned out, it hurts in that you wish you could kind of go back in time and do something different than you did. But under the conditions that we had and the information we had to work with, we felt like we did as good as we could. Unfortunately, it wasn't good enough to save Lisa.
The 4 kidnappers were tried soon after her body was found. Demetrius Hall became a witness for the state and accepted a plea bargain of 25 years. Stephen Beckley did the same and got 30 years. Orlando Hall received the death penalty for interstate kidnapping resulting in death. A few months later, Bruce Webster received the same sentence. Both were sent to death row at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The trials were little consolation to Lisa's sister Pearl, who could barely absorb the fact that the bright teenager would never realize her dream of becoming a surgeon.
I thought I'd feel better, but I really don't. Because, it's not going to bring her back. The only thing that's going to make it better is Lisa was here today, and she's not coming back.
For Arlington Police Detective John Stanton, Lisa Rene's murder had disturbing implications.
It just solidified the fact that things can happen to people who are completely and totally unrelated to criminal activities. No one is exempt from the possibility that, for no real reason of their own, they get put in a position where their life is in jeopardy. And Lisa Rene is a prime example of someone that, in the years that I've been doing this, she is actually probably the most innocent victim that I've ever worked a case on. And it's something that we'd all need to remember, that even if you're an innocent victim, you can still be a victim.
For Special Agent Garrett Floyd and investigators alike, the case was personal.
I have a daughter who's approximately the same age as Lisa Rene. And to believe that someone could take a child, a young lady, and do the things that they did to her and then kill her without any respect for life takes that father image in me to a different level. because we love our children. And we know that we will have to take care and keep them out of harm's way. And on a Saturday night, if my daughter's doing homework and I happen to run to the store, they could break in my house and take my daughter and do the same thing.
In the mid-1990s, a gang of professional bank robbers raided cities across 7 states. Disguises and speed protected their identity from cameras and the police. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, always leaving a bomb to terrorize their victims. With no leads and little evidence, the FBI had to find the bandits before someone got killed.
Across the Midwest, a band of armed robbers struck banks at the rate of nearly 1 per month. They attacked with lightning precision and lethal force. They were in and out in 5 minutes. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The stakes were raised when the FBI discovered the robbers had an agenda beyond personal wealth. To stop these violent extremists, the FBI need to capture their terrorist leaders.
In 1994, the citizens of Ames, Iowa enjoyed the peaceful life provided by a small college town. Many newcomers had moved to Ames because of the area's low crime rate. On January 25th at 10:30 in the morning, 2 men entered a bank in town.
All right, this is a robbery! Everybody down on the floor! Down, down, down on the ground! Down, get on the
They
floor!
wore ski masks and held semi-automatic pistols. They ordered everyone to the floor. The teller managed to set off a silent alarm without being seen. The FBI office in nearby Des Moines was alerted to the robbery in progress. The agency had primary investigative jurisdiction in crimes involving federally insured money. Agents immediately responded, but they were 30 miles away from the bank. The bandits quickly emptied the cash drawers.
Don't look at me, face the ground.
One of them pulled out what appeared to be a bomb. He warned that no one should move for 5 minutes or it would explode. The employees and customers evacuated as soon as they could. The local police cordoned off the bank as explosive experts worked inside. The bomb proved to be a diversion. 2 road flares bound with duct tape. The employees described how one of the gunmen leaped over the counter to grab the money. They grabbed thousands in cash and were in and out of the bank in less than 5 minutes. Agents interviewed the witnesses.
So did you guys want to add anything else?
They said the gunmen sometimes used Spanish when talking to each other. The security camera provided photographs of the robbery. Ski masks effectively hid the faces of the assailants. But investigators had images of their disguises and their weapons. 9mm semi-automatics. Because the perpetrators wore gloves, they did not leave any fingerprints. Detectives used electrostatic tape to recover a footprint from the counter. The precautions taken by the bandits had effectively obscured their identities. Special Agent Ken Moore of the Des Moines, Iowa FBI field office was immediately concerned that they were dealing with dangerous professionals.
Now, most bank robbers try to enter banks as quietly as possible, go up to one teller counter and proceed to rob the bank, and then leave as quietly as they can. These individuals came in very violently, fast.
Agent Moore wanted to apprehend the suspects as quickly as he could. But the FBI had nothing of value to lead to their identity. Several weeks later, a communique came into the Des Moines office. It alerted area FBI of a February 15th bank robbery in Davenport, Iowa. Agents contacted the Davenport office to see if the incident might be related.
Hello? Yes, well, I think we're working on
The agent described two gunmen wearing ski masks and black overcoats that had invaded a Davenport bank. The thieves used the same Spanish phrases as the Des Moines bandits. They also hopped over the counter to empty the cash drawers. There was one significant difference. This time, the bandits left a real explosive, a pipe bomb instead of a fake. Fortunately, the detonator was missing. Disarming it had slowed down the investigation.
What that device does is it requires more manpower that could be out conducting an active investigation. Instead, they're at the bank making sure things are safe.
Investigators believed that the similarities between the incidents were more than coincidental.
After the Davenport bank robbery, we realized that the same individuals were responsible for both bank robberies. This was our first connection to possible serial bank robbers.
Okay. See you later. Have a good night.
In the next 4 months, Cincinnati, Green Bay, and Kansas City suffered similar crimes.
There appeared to be a pattern of their robberies. There appeared to be two regions where they were robbing banks, the Midwest region as well as the Ohio region. We were trying to logically connect those two regions and why banks were being robbed that way.
The robberies occurred between 10 and 11 in the morning when banks were less populated. Each time, the bandits were out in less than 5 minutes, always leaving an inert bomb as they fled. The wide geographic spread of targets made their next moves impossible to predict.
I'll get back with you.
The FBI needed to find some evidence that would lead to the suspects. On June 8, 1994, the bandits hit a bank in Springdale, Ohio. They drove away with over $11,000. A bystander saw them use a brown Chevrolet as their getaway car. On June 17th, a security guard became suspicious of a car on his employer's lot. It had been sitting for a week without anyone claiming it. He saw a police scanner. He also spotted a pager next to a stained $20 bill. A Springdale officer came out to check the car. He began a search to ascertain the vehicle's ownership. He made an effort to force open the glove compartment. A grenade tumbled out. The hand grenade turned out to be another inert explosive, but its presence linked the car to the bank robbery. Agents used the car's serial numbers to track down the dealership where it had been sold. They talked to the salesman who had handled the deal. The sale had been made less than 2 weeks earlier, but he couldn't give a description of the buyer. The dead ends left investigators feeling the pressure.
We were becoming frustrated because the escalation of violence seemed to have been increasing. They were more brazen, were brandishing firearms, scaring bank employees. They were scaring customers, leaving behind booby traps. So we were very frustrated and we were concerned.
On December 27th, the bandits finished 1994 with their 12th robbery in as many months. They hit a bank outside St. Louis. This time, there were 4 gunmen.
Now we were concerned over possible takeovers of banks, possible entry into the bank vault. With 4 people, there's a lot more they can do.
Bystanders of the St. Louis robbery saw the bandits put on their ski masks before entering the building. A teller got a glimpse of one of them inside the bank. These witnesses helped FBI artists make composite sketches of the suspects. The FBI distributed the drawings to other agencies and the media.
It was slightly curved.
They hoped it might bring someone forward who might know something more. The television and news reports generated hundreds of calls into the FBI offices. Agents followed up on all credible tips, but none provided any lead value. The assailants communicated with the media as well. They sent letters and cartoons to newspapers. The correspondents ridiculed federal agents in their attempts to catch them. In one letter, the gang dubbed themselves the Midwestern Bank Bandits. The bandits sent another message to authorities in one of their getaway cars. An investigator searched a vehicle used in a robbery near St. Louis. On the front seat, the gang had left a newspaper clipping about Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. In less than 2 years, the bandits had hit at least 15 banks across the Midwest. By the end of August 1995, agents from 7 states and FBI headquarters gathered in Louisville, Kentucky. All the offices were now working together to identify and apprehend the suspects. All information and leads were to be channeled through a single office, then distributed to the others.
Right, we'll work on that. See if we can't raise the serial number or something off it.
Special Agent Moore in Des Moines served as the point man.
The meeting also resulted in all case agents going back to their office, reviewing all files to see if there's anything they may have missed or anything of lead value that might assist us in identifying the suspects.
Supervisory Special Agent David Welker found a phone tip that came into his Cincinnati office after a June 1994 robbery. The informant had named 2 men as the leaders of the Midwestern Bank Bandits, Peter Langan and Richard Guthrie.
We determined at the time that they had criminal backgrounds, that as we set out our leads, that they had been arrested in Georgia for the robbery of a Pizza Hut. And then we found also at the time that the U.S. Secret Service had looked at Langan as a result of threats made to the president.
At the arrest, police seized semi-automatic guns and grenades, weapons similar to those used by the bank bandits. The suspects served a brief prison sentence before being released. Agent Welker was able to pull their mugshots. He compared the photographs with the artist's sketches made after the St. Louis robberies.
And they were so close then that it was phenomenal. It appeared that the composite artist used these photographs to draw the composite drawings. That's how close they were.
Agents now had names for the gunmen. In pursuing them, the FBI was about to uncover a far more deadly plot than bank robbery. In 1995, the FBI hunted the Midwestern Bank Bandits. The day before Thanksgiving, the 4 gunmen struck another bank in St. Louis, their 21st robbery. Their disguise included ATF hats, the same caps worn by federal agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They also left their signature pipe bomb. None of these explosive devices had gone off. They had either been inert or lacking detonators. By now, agents knew how to defuse the bombs themselves. They weren't going to let the ruse slow the investigation down anymore. Supervisory Special Agent David Welker of the Cincinnati office had names for two of the bandits. But Peter Langan and Richard Guthrie were living underground, surfacing only when they struck another bank.
Clearly, we've identified the right people. We're trying to develop as much information about these people and their contacts as possible. But the best part about it is we have leads to follow.
In the intervening months, the informant who had provided the names had moved from Ohio.
The first set of robberies to tear gas
canister.
Special Agent Ed Woods of the Cincinnati FBI field office tracked the informant to Georgia, where he lived with his new wife and child.
This fella had been an associate of Langan and Guthrie in the past, had removed himself from that lifestyle and was starting a new life for himself. And I think he was ready to put all that behind him. So when I interviewed him, he cooperated fully.
I need to ask you a few questions.
The informant had met Langan in 1991 at a white supremacist rally.
The Bible says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife and a black neighbor. Right.
They shared similar beliefs about race and government.
Don't need it. Don't need it.
A year later, Langan proclaimed his intention to form the Aryan Republican Army. It was going to start a revolution against Washington and its federal agencies like the FBI and ATF.
That's your tax money they're taking.
Langan had been inspired by the Order, an established terrorist group.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? You're breaking your back. You know what I'm saying?
The Order had financed their racist agenda by robbing $4 million from banks and armored cars.
Hey, how's it going?
That evening, Langan introduced Guthrie as his compatriot.
I'll explain all about that. Yeah, definitely so.
2 months before the first bank robbery, they asked the informant to become a member of the Aryan Army.
Well, I've got some stuff here. I think that
He declined to join the new gang.
we can certainly use some of it. Yeah, here. Okay.
But he did agree to pitch in.
What we got from this cooperating witness was the scope of their activities, the surgical planning for their bank robbery activities, the fact that now we learned for the first time that their activities aren't just bank robbery and criminal matters. It relates to white supremacy.
The informant helped Langan case the bank in Springdale, Ohio. But before that June 1994 robbery, the informant had a change of heart and cut himself off from the bandits.
Sometimes, things like that.
He had participated enough to be charged as an
I need you
accomplice.
to help as we go on here.
The FBI promised not to prosecute him if he assisted.
For right now.
They were ready to make a
appreciate it.
deal to capture Langan and Guthrie.
Once we determined that they had broken off other white supremacist organizations to form their own, it certainly ratcheted the investigation up just another notch.
Agent Welker suspected it was only a matter of time before the Midwestern bank bandits turned their racial prejudice into violence. The gang was back in Cincinnati, hitting another bank in December 1995. During their escape, one of the bandits bumped into a teenager. The gunman demanded her purse. She refused to comply. Only the sound of approaching sirens prevented the young woman from being seriously hurt. Betting that the bandits were still in the area, Agent Welker brought the informant to Cincinnati.
You know the fellows that are involved.
Upon arriving, the informant agreed to re-enter the white supremacist movement.
Make sure that he has your pager.
Agents instructed him to page the FBI when he made contact with the suspects.
So, say what you
But investigators became frustrated when more than a week passed without any results.
Since he's been here for a week and a half and has provided no information at all and has arranged no meeting, has virtually done nothing, I was more than skeptical as to what this cooperating witness could do for us. And I was prepared to send him home because of my disbelief at the time.
At 2:30 in the morning of January 17th, 1996, the informant paged the FBI. The call roused investigators from sleep to a secret meeting. The informant claimed to have found Guthrie. He was finishing dinner with a friend when Guthrie unexpectedly showed up. The informant invented a reason for being in Cincinnati and engaged the suspect in small talk.
Got a minute, I can talk to you outside. Sure, come on. Hey, you got a minute?
Guthrie invited him out to his van to continue the conversation in private.
Where are you chilling?
While they sat in the parking lot, the suspect asked his old friend to reconsider joining the gang.
Some serious stuff here, isn't it? You talking about a little bit.
Guthrie showed off an assault rifle and a bag of armor-piercing bullets.
Yeah.
The informant provided a partial license plate number and description of Guthrie's van. Agents still doubted his credibility.
So I had Agent Woods arrange to have the cooperating witness in the FBI office at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. I didn't want him to know why he was there. I just wanted him to be there. And then I arranged for my division's polygraph examiner to be there, and I wanted a polygraph of him. I wanted to make sure that what he was telling us was true.
The informant agreed to take a lie detector test.
I think he's lying. You think he's lying?
It's all over the place.
Give him a chance and he didn't tell us.
The examiner determined that the young man had been deceptive in his answers during the test.
I'm telling the truth. Listen.
The piece of paper there, this polygraph doesn't lie.
Listen,
He insisted he was telling the truth.
I can make a quick phone call. Please, let me make one phone call.
1 second.
I can prove it. I can
give
prove
you
it.
one more
phone call.
chance.
Yes,
One
come on.
phone call. Make it a good one.
To prove it, he placed a call to the friend with whom he had had dinner.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Good, man. Yeah.
The speakerphone allowed the agents to hear everything.
Hey, what happened with you and Guthrie, man? He took you out in the van. Yeah, Guthrie wants you in, man. Yeah.
Without prompting, the
Yeah,
friend
we did. We
immediately
spent some
asked
time
about his
together.
time with Guthrie.
So now we had to make a decision, and the decision is, do we believe the polygraph or do we believe the phone call? I think at the time, the decision we made was the right one. That is, we have to believe the phone call. It was an unprovoked response by the friend.
The informant arranged to meet Guthrie on Monday at their mutual friend's apartment. FBI agents assembled an arrest team. They staked out the location, ready to capture the suspect when he arrived. The informant waited inside the apartment. The friend did not know why the meeting had been arranged. Guthrie had promised to come sometime between 4 and 5 p.m. 5 o'clock came and went without the white supremacist arriving. The informant knew that more than his credibility was at stake. So was his cooperation agreement. If the FBI believed he had deceived them, they would turn him over to prosecutors for bank robbery. At 5:20, there was still no sign of Guthrie. It looked like the suspect would not show up. Outside, the arrest team grew impatient. It was Guthrie on the phone. He said they could meet at a nearby pizza restaurant in 30 minutes.
All right, 30 minutes.
Camel, down?
Yeah.
The informant needed to get word to the arrest team. He told his buddy he was going out for cigarettes.
Hey, I'm sorry about the delay. Everything's taken care of, though.
The informant told the agents about the call.
Yeah. The meeting's been changed just a little bit. We're meeting just a little bit up the road. Everything's still fine, though, okay?
I think he's telling us the truth. I hope he is. Otherwise, he's going to jail. Okay, guys.
They alerted the SWAT team to the new location. Several cars set out for the pizza parlor. The agents could not help but wonder if this was the location or just another diversion. Along the way, traffic separated the arrest team. One agent was passing a convenience store parking lot when he spotted Guthrie. He turned around and radioed to the others that the suspect had been sighted. Guthrie got into his van and started driving. The agent stayed on the van's tail, hoping the rest of the team would catch up. He was alone, following a suspect considered highly dangerous. But he was determined not to let Richard Guthrie get away. In January 1996, the FBI pursued Richard Guthrie. The suspect was wanted for 22 bank robberies. An agent separated from the arrest team had spotted the suspect at a Cincinnati parking lot and began tailing his van. He reported by radio his progress to the others.
You got him in a cul-de-sac. Where are you?
Guthrie noticed that he was being followed. An informant had reported that he was armed with automatic weapons and armor-piercing bullets. The suspect tried to lose his tail. The arrest team caught up with the lone agent and joined the chase. Guthrie couldn't shake them.
Get him in a cul-de-sac.
He unwittingly turned into a cul-de-sac. Trapped, he abandoned his van. Agent Ed Wood sprinted right behind. He caught up to the gunman.
It was almost as if it was in slow motion where like you could almost read his mind, what he's thinking. He's thinking, I believe, is this it? Is this the last standoff of this white supremacist? And quite frankly, what I expected him to do was to turn and start firing.
Guthrie came to a riverbank. He had no escape. Agents boxed him in.
I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and I've never seen a look on a face like Guthrie's at the time. And Guthrie, as he was looking at us, he was deciding whether he wanted to die right then. He was deciding whether he wanted to pull a gun and take on everybody who was standing there.
The suspect chose to live. He submitted to arrest.
Catching him, it was a huge relief, and catching him to where there was no violence attached to the arrest was even a greater relief.
Once in custody, Guthrie began talking. He told investigators how he stayed in touch with the other primary suspect, Peter Langan.
What are these numbers right here?
The friends used coded voicemails to contact one another. He handed over his
John,
pager
how
and
about this
PIN
one right
number.
here? Now, how about this one right here?
He claimed his next meeting with Langan was to be in Indianapolis.
John, did you get that?
Guthrie's lawyer made an agreement with the FBI. For later consideration in sentencing, they could take the suspect with them to use as bait. Under the arrangement, the accompanying agents weren't allowed to question Guthrie about his crimes. Agent Welker sought another way to ply information from the bandits' leader.
I assigned 2 agents to guard him. One agent is a former Harrier pilot in the Marine Corps, and the other is our principal firearms instructor. And of course, over a 2-day period, there was a lot of discussion going on. I was well aware that Guthrie had an interest in flying, and he had a keen interest in weapons.
During the trip, the agents engaged Guthrie in long conversations about common interests. The congenial strategy worked. The assailant warmed up to his accompanying agents and began volunteering information on the robberies. Guthrie admitted that he had lied to investigators. His rendezvous was really supposed to take place in Columbus, Ohio, not Indianapolis, where the investigators had taken him.
2709 Control.
He gave them the address of a safe house. He told them Langan was heavily armed. He would not come out without a fight. An FBI arrest team assembled the next morning in Columbus. Langan's van was parked next to the duplex Guthrie had described. The plan was to wait until the suspect exited his home and got into his van. Then as he pulled out, FBI cars would box him in. This would contain him and prevent a vehicular pursuit. All escape avenues were blocked off. At 9:30 a.m., Langan left the duplex carrying a canvas bag. Agents suspected this held an assault weapon. He got into his van, but failed to start the engine. The arrest team waited for the word.
Once he was observed getting into the van, the adrenaline for everyone there was flowing. Everyone knew something was going to happen.
The suspect sat motionless. Agents didn't know if he was planning something. He seemed as if he anticipated the arrest. Finally, the signal went out to move in.
Let's take him, let's take him.
In what agents thought was a suicide move, Langan had decided to put up a fight. On January 18th, 1996, the suspected leader of 22 bank robberies decided to shoot it out with an FBI SWAT team. Supervisory Special Agent David Welker of the Cincinnati office led the arrest team.
Someone who's going to pull a gun on 20 or more FBI agents is one nasty dude. He's one nasty criminal.
Peter Langan was one gun against many. SWAT team bullets pummeled the van. It was over within moments, but not before 50 rounds had been fired. Langan survived and surrendered. Despite the hail of bullets, he suffered only minor injuries to the face and back. After 2 years of pursuit, the leaders of the Midwestern bank bandits were now in custody. 2 other accomplices remained at large. The van was filled with semi-automatic guns, ammunition, and grenades. Inside the canvas bag, agents found a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. It was the same make of weapon that the bank bandits used. Evidence inside the duplex confirmed the bandits were more than a gang of thieves. The house contained an armory big enough to equip a small cadre of terrorists. Agents found ski masks, FBI hats, police uniforms, and false IDs from nearly every state of the Union. Books and literature detailed the gang's creed of militant hate.
I'm Commander Pedro.
Investigators discovered a tape among the propaganda. It targeted young white males for recruitment into the Aryan Republican Army.
Today, we are preparing to take over the USA. Tomorrow, the world.
Please have a seat.
A Columbus bank teller had briefly glimpsed the face of one of the bandits 17 months earlier.
See anybody that you recognize, please?
Detectives gave her a photo lineup, hoping she could remember enough to make an ID.
This gentleman here?
Despite the intervening months, she picked out Langan from the array of similar-looking men. While Langan refused to cooperate, Guthrie agreed to tell all he knew. Agents debriefed him 10 hours a day for 10 straight days.
How many accomplices did you have?
He could recall all the places, times, and dates. It took 99 pages to detail the 22 robberies.
Scott and John, okay.
But when it came to his at-large accomplices, Guthrie only knew their first names. The bank bandits had been assembled like an underground terrorist cell. Personal information on others was kept to a minimum to prevent capture. Guthrie could only offer that the man he knew only as Scott was involved in music. The man he knew as Kevin was the nephew of a police
This is
officer.
Supervisor Special Agent.
Both lived in the Philadelphia area.
Yeah.
The scant information was forwarded to Pennsylvania. Special Agent Joe Hendrickson of the Philadelphia FBI field office was initially overwhelmed by the request.
There was no hope of finding these people with that information. I sat back and had a cup of coffee, and then I said, well, I'll go contact the Philadelphia Police Department. And there's a possibility that maybe their personnel records indicate nephews, but I was in much doubt that that type of record existed, because I know that in my outfit, I did not list nieces and nephews in my personnel file.
Philadelphia had 7,000 police officers, any one of which could be Kevin's uncle. The search began at the intelligence division of the police department. An officer knew immediately who the FBI was looking for. The division had been keeping tabs on white supremacists in the area. Intelligence officers had kept them under surveillance for over a year. Officers often spotted them meeting on a farm belonging to Mark Thomas.
Over the years, the Philadelphia Police Department had been taking down tags at various rallies and so forth. And at some point in time, they took down a tag, ran the tag, and it came out to Kevin McCarthy. And then they said, you know, we've got a lieutenant here that has that name. They contacted him, and lo and behold, they found out that Kevin McCarthy was attending Aryan Nation rallies.
Hendrickson put a surveillance squad on Kevin McCarthy. They observed him repeatedly visiting a recording studio in Philadelphia. Agents noted the license numbers of the cars outside the business. They ran the plates for all the people going in and out. One of the vehicles belonged to a man named Scott Stediford. He managed the studio and also played drums in McCarthy's band. From his amateur photo, Guthrie confirmed that this was the Scott he had worked with. Using that same photo, A witness also recognized Stediford as the getaway driver in the Des Moines robbery. An arrest warrant was sent to Philadelphia. The studio presented too many risks for officers to invade en force. Agents could not be sure who was inside and what weapons might be hidden. They didn't want another shootout.
We're writing it for my mom, actually, and these are the lyrics I came up with. And
Two undercover agents posed as father and daughter. The female agent asked Stediford about the cost of studio time. She claimed she wanted to record a song for her mother.
Can you grab your guitar?
As Stediford considered a quote, the undercover agents confirmed that he was alone and unarmed.
Okay, turn around. Up. You're under arrest. Turn around. Hands behind
The
your
agents
back.
drew on him. They placed him under arrest.
Nothing to do with that.
The FBI did not have an arrest warrant for Kevin McCarthy. They feared that he would run once he heard about Stediford's capture.
What we ended up doing was we brought his uncle, the Philadelphia police officer, with us. We felt that with his blood relative, the law enforcement presence, and the total set of circumstances, that we hoped that he would somehow be convinced that the thing to do would be to cooperate.
The uncle entered the basement bedroom. He disarmed his sleeping nephew. The agent woke the young man.
Kevin? Special Agent FBI. Son?
He began explaining that it was in McCarthy's best interest to cooperate with the FBI.
Yes, okay. We kind of know what went on today. We know who
Only
was
suspicion
with.
tied the young man to the
Through
crimes.
that, things are going to go a lot easier on you, all right?
The agent needed a confession.
You have something you want to give us?
He showed McCarthy the 99-page admission made by Guthrie.
And when he saw this report describing every bank robbery, what they did, where they went, he realized that we had all the information. He just didn't realize that we had no evidence.
The young man was overwhelmed. He voluntarily turned over the weapon and clothing he used in the robberies. When he began to confess, his uncle stopped him and advised him to get a lawyer. With all the suspects now in custody, agents considered their investigation wrapped up. On July 3, 1996, Richard Guthrie pleaded guilty to 19 bank robberies. He agreed to testify against his accomplices. With his cooperation, prosecutors considered their case airtight. Nine days later, the cooperating witness hanged himself in a jail cell. The suicide devastated the government's case.
Now that created a major problem for the prosecution because since Guthrie could no longer be cross-examined, his information couldn't be used directly against Langan.
If the other bank bandits were going to be convicted, the FBI had to find someone else who could corroborate Guthrie's confession. In 1996, the legal case against the Midwestern bank bandits was on the verge of collapse. The chief cooperating witness had killed himself. Without his testimony, the evidence against his captured co-defendants was slim. Special Agent Joe Hendrickson spearheaded the investigation in Philadelphia.
These bank robbers were very, very good, and the evidence that they left behind at every robbery was zero. They were fully masked, fully gloved. Their weapons were untraceable.
Hendrickson helped convince Kevin McCarthy to plead guilty and turn state's witness. But prosecutors needed more than one cooperating felon to convict the others. Investigators focused on the man who had steered suspects into the Aryan Republican Army. Mark Thomas had turned Scott Stediford and Kevin McCarthy into outlaws. Thomas edited a newsletter and webpage for white supremacists. His literature and videos had swayed many young men into racist and anti-government organizations.
And we felt that even though he was not personally involved in these crimes, that he had caused these crimes to come about. And therefore he was responsible. And based on conspiracy laws, we felt that it was quite possible to go after him for conspiring to commit bank robbery.
The FBI made weekly contact with Thomas at his Pennsylvania farm.
I want to ask you some questions.
They wanted to know about his activities, but more importantly, they wanted to keep pressure on him.
15 years. 15 years. You live here alone? You know, I've had about enough of you guys coming over and messing with me.
They made it clear that they suspected him and weren't going away.
Cool.
Kevin McCarthy told investigators that he and Scott Stediford had stayed at Thomas's home.
This stuff is going to change your life. Yeah.
He acted like a father figure to them and warned them of the coming race war. He brought the young men to live in Elohim City, a white separatist compound in Oklahoma. During the summer of 1994, Thomas invited them to join the Aryan Republican Army. In mid-October, Scott Stediford agreed. He participated in his first bank robbery 2 weeks later. On November 13th, Thomas drove Kevin McCarthy to Arkansas for an introduction to Langan and Guthrie. The teenager heard them boast of successfully robbing banks throughout the Midwest. The 17-year-old joined up.
We found a better way to do it.
Agents also learned from McCarthy that Thomas took $100 in stolen money for the start of an Aryan war chest. Over the months of contact, agents caught Thomas in several lies about his activities.
This is my farm, and I don't need you on my farm, you know? So
They took what they had to U.S. prosecutors.
okay, I'm doing what he says.
The United States Attorney's Office decided that based on the cooperating witnesses' testimony, we were going to arrest him. Even though it was a very slim case, it was a close call, as the United States Attorney's Office would say, but we're going to put out an arrest warrant for him.
Thomas heard that the FBI was going to pick him up on a charge of conspiracy. He agreed to surrender after calling the media to witness the event. He told the press their presence prevented his assassination. Thomas pleaded not guilty at his arraignment hearing on February 4th, 1997.
No comment.
He asked to meet with the FBI the next day. That's where Mark Thomas caved. He signed a 7-page plea agreement that corroborated Kevin McCarthy's confession. The government's case was now solid.
This was the biggest surprise of anyone's involved in the case. The idea that the head of the movement, after one day in prison, would decide to completely cooperate was just unfathomable. But apparently our pressure over the 6 months of continually talking to him, and then the one night in prison, was enough for him to decide that he had been completely wrong in his ideals and that he wanted to, as he said, get right with God.
Mark Thomas was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. Peter Langan was convicted on bank robbery and gun charges. He received life without parole. Kevin McCarthy got 5 years. His testimony helped convict Scott Stediford on 2 counts of armed bank robbery. The court sentenced Stediford to 29.5 years. In America, extremist groups enjoy the freedom to maintain their beliefs. They are constitutionally protected until they cross the legal line. If they engage in outlaw activities, they will find the FBI on a mission to stop them. A Labor Day weekend turned into a nightmare of murder as a cross-country crime spree terrorized the nation. A pair of suspected spree killers traveled through state after state, leaving murder victims in their wake. Working against time, the FBI and local authorities marshaled their resources to stop the killings.
In a small Ohio community, an elderly woman and a teenage boy disappeared. Because they vanished within hours of each other, police believe the cases were linked, but they didn't know how. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. A trail of stolen vehicles and murder victims across 7 states led the FBI on a hunt for 2 serial killers. Their only hope of stopping them was to anticipate the killer's next move.
August 29th, 1994. Summer was drawing to a close in the small town of Port Washington, Ohio. The peaceful farming community was dotted with isolated rural homes. A 79-year-old widow, Ruth Loader, lived alone. Those of her family that lived nearby kept a close eye on Mrs. Loader since she was battling with cancer. When she heard footsteps in the kitchen, she thought it might be her granddaughter returning to see her before she went to sleep. She discovered strangers instead. The following morning, the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Office received an urgent call from Mrs. Loader's sister. As was their routine, Mrs. Loader's sister and son-in-law came to check on the sick woman, but found Mrs. Loader and her car missing. Sheriff Walter Wilson, a detective lieutenant at the time, was the lead investigator.
Family members had seen Mrs. Loader the evening prior to the morning of her disappearance. She was fine at that time. They had indicated to us that Mrs. Loader was recovering from cancer surgery, that she definitely needed medication, which was left behind.
The family was worried since Mrs. Loader was so weak. She would become very ill if she was without her medication for long.
Go ahead and go with him.
Marks on the back door and damage to the door frame indicated it had been kicked in. The forced entry told the sheriff that the frail woman had not left of her own free will. Mrs. Loader's purse was left behind, but her cash was missing, along with the keys to her red Buick. Sheriff Wilson immediately issued an all-points bulletin for the widow and her car.
Sheriff's Department.
He knew that they'd have the best chance of finding her alive if they acted quickly.
We felt very early on that Mrs. Loader obviously had been kidnapped. We immediately began a massive search for Mrs. Loader and her car. Then that involved all of the area law enforcement agencies. It involved numerous fire department personnel. Citizens from the area came out in droves and helped with the search for Mrs. Loader.
And I need you two to work rush. We're going to try to stay in this general area.
Concerned over her fate, the community was united in its pursuit.
We have to finish before they do. Okay?
The command center was formed in the Port Washington Fire Station, where authorities worked with volunteers to plan the urgent search for the ailing woman. If she didn't have her medicine soon, her condition could become critical. They had to find the grandmother before it was too late.
Report back here every 2 hours and let us know. Okay?
Mrs. Loader was pretty well known in that area. It's a very good family.
They're very highly thought of, and everyone was very concerned for her and felt obligated and really sincerely wanted to try to find her to help her.
Mounted reserve units geared up to comb rougher terrain on horseback. Local police and neighbors searched fields and woods for any trace of her or the missing car. Sheriff's deputies from a neighboring county brought in canine units hoping to pick up a scent. The Ohio State Highway Patrol ordered their aircraft to scan roads from above. The extensive search turned up no trace of Mrs. Loader or her car. Special collections were taken at restaurants and grocery stores to help pay for additional personnel. Deputies alerted the media while family members posted flyers in neighboring towns, hoping to get the word out beyond the local community.
Okay, thanks. These gentlemen will help you. Hi.
That afternoon, a woman who knew Mrs. Loader called the sheriff's office with information and came in for an interview.
Appreciate you coming in.
You know, I heard about Mrs. Loader's disappearance.
She told investigators that she'd seen Mrs. Loader's red Buick in town at about 11 p.m. the previous evening. She thought it was strange that the ailing woman would be driving that late. Though the light was dim, she could see that a young man was driving the car.
Just kind of went
Bushy and thrown back.
not too bushy, not in
The witness tried her best to help a police artist construct a composite sketch from what she could remember of the brief encounter.
Is that him?
In the area surrounding Port Washington, Ohio, concern that a criminal could be on the loose spread fear in a community that was not used to locking their doors. Police showed the composite sketch at every interview, but no one could identify the man depicted in the drawing. The day ended with no new leads. On day 2 of Mrs. Loader's disappearance, a deputy entered her case into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a computer system linking 57,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
Sheriff's Department.
That same day, the sheriff's office fielded a call from some concerned parents.
Can you describe him for me?
Their 16-year-old high school sophomore had also disappeared from Tuscarawas County.
Okay, his clothing, jeans.
In nearby Newcomerstown, 3 miles from the
Any
house where Mrs.
scars,
Loader
tattoos,
disappeared,
body marks?
a worried father and stepmother told a sheriff's deputy their son was missing. His family and his former employer had not heard from him for 3 days.
His red shirt. Do you have a picture of him?
Yes, I do.
One other thing too, officer.
A .22 caliber handgun was also missing from the house.
Is it silver?
The parents gave authorities a photograph of the missing boy, Eric Elliott.
It seemed kind of ironic at the time that we would have Mrs. Loader missing and that we would also have a juvenile reported missing within that short distance.
Ohio investigators wondered if there was any connection between the 2 disappearances from the same county. Just 36 hours after Mrs. Loader's abduction, Sheriff Wilson received another call.
Hello?
650 miles west in Fulton, Missouri, police found a red Buick stuck in a farmer's muddy field. When they ran its Ohio plates through the NCIC, they discovered it was Mrs. Loader's stolen car. The farmer had not seen who had abandoned it. The car's keys were missing, but the doors were unlocked. Among the items officers found inside was a green soda bottle and a sandwich wrapper labeled Goshen Dairy Store. They towed the vehicle to the station for further examination. Lieutenant Timothy Daimler from the Callaway County Sheriff's Office in Fulton, Missouri, was assigned to lead the investigation. His department's first task was to check the car's locked trunk.
We weren't sure exactly what we were going to find,
We had a missing lady from Ohio, and this was her car, so we were under the assumption that very possibly we may find a body when we opened up the trunk.
Investigators needed to open it without damaging evidence or injuring the woman if she was unconscious inside. An auxiliary deputy who was a locksmith was called in. They discovered the trunk was empty. After 3 days of searching, hope of finding Mrs. Loader alive was beginning to fade. On September 1st, an FBI evidence recovery team from Kansas City was called in, since the missing woman's car had crossed state lines. Agents worked with local authorities processing Mrs. Loader's car for forensic details. They gathered several sets of prints and hairs. In Ohio, the foreign prints were entered into an automated fingerprint system, but no matches were found. Sheriff Wilson prepared to travel to Missouri. On a hunch, he took along a photo of the missing teenager, Eric Elliott.
At the time, it was nothing concrete as far as connecting Mrs. Loader's disappearance and Mr. Elliott's report of his son missing. However, I felt that since we're going to Callaway County, you know, it would make sense to maybe obtain a photograph of the missing juvenile and take with us.
Mrs. Loader's son-in-law joined the sheriff to help in the investigation.
See what we can do.
The Missouri official did not recognize the photo, but the Ohio sheriff did recognize the sandwich wrapper found in the car. It was from Goshen Dairy, a store near Mrs. Loader's house. Her son-in-law said the family kept her vehicle clean. Perhaps Eric Elliott, who also lived close to the store, had left the wrapper in the car.
They had a photograph of Elliott with them, and we decided to cover Kingdom City, where they would have gotten off the interstate.
Ohio and Missouri investigators checked exits along nearby I-70, a major east-west route in the region. They hoped someone at the rest stops would be able to confirm that Elliott had been in the area. They spoke to dozens of employees and travelers. Late in the afternoon, their efforts finally paid off.
You ever seen him since then?
No, I haven't.
They found one person who remembered seeing the teenager the day before. Unfortunately, authorities found no one who remembered seeing Mrs. Loader or her car. For the first time, investigators considered 16-year-old Eric Elliott as a suspect in her abduction. Missouri deputies also continued to canvass the rural Fulton area, inquiring if neighbors had seen anything unusual. At the house closest to the field where Mrs. Loader's car was found, an officer knocked on the door of an elderly couple, William and Flossie Brewer. He heard their dog, but the couple appeared to be out. Since their car was not parked outside, the deputy continued on. Authorities checked dozens of homes, but found no one close by who had seen Eric Elliott or Mrs. Loader.
I was on my way home. After finishing that up, I received a page from the communications center that they wanted me to call them immediately. They told me that they had found two bodies at a farmhouse out on County Road 147.
It was the home of William and Flossie Brewer, the house closest to the field where Mrs. Loader's car was found earlier that day. Authorities believe the two crimes were likely connected. 3 days after Mrs. Loader's disappearance, sheriff's detectives found the bodies of 86-year-old William Brewer and his 76-year-old wife Flossie in the basement of their home. Each had multiple gunshot wounds.
They were slumped over. They were near the door. She had her hands tied behind her back, with what appeared to be a telephone cord, and he was on her right, slumped over also, and his cane was standing there right beside him.
The detective also found the couple's dog faithfully guarding their lifeless bodies. An autopsy later determined that both Mr. and Mrs. Brewer had each been shot 3 times in the head with a .22, the same caliber weapon missing from Eric Elliott's home. The 16-year-old suspected in the disappearance of Mrs. Loader now became a suspect in the double homicide.
There was no indication that the suspect had spent any length of time in the house before this occurred, so from the evidence it pointed us that it had happened relatively quickly.
Investigators found no signs of forced entry. In the basement, the door to the outside was covered with cobwebs, indicating it had not been opened.
It was yesterday. Now,
Investigators spoke with the Brewer's son. He said the couple's Oldsmobile was missing, along with several rifles.
Missing from around the house.
All were entered into the NCIC.
Yeah, the gun's missing and the revolver.
The son added that his mother's bedspread was also missing. Technicians worked the scene until 5 a.m. On the floor near the front entrance, investigators found 2 distinct sets of footprints foreign to the house.
Did they keep a key for this?
One appeared to be a tennis shoe, the other a hiking boot. Investigators suspected the double homicide was likely connected to Mrs. Loader's disappearance. What they didn't know was if 16-year-old Eric Elliott and a companion had become spree killers. By September 2nd, 1994, 4.5 days had passed since the ailing Ruth Loader was forced from her Ohio home without her medication. She was missing and presumed dead since her stolen car was found abandoned in Missouri, 150 yards from where police discovered a slain elderly couple. Authorities suspected an Ohio teenager named Eric Elliott and at least one companion were responsible for the crimes. But they had no direct evidence. Lieutenant Timothy Daimler of the Callaway County, Missouri Sheriff's Department recalled that citizens in the surrounding areas were stunned.
These are people that live in the rural community. They're used to leaving their doors unlocked. They do know everybody. And I think it was somewhat of a realization that, unfortunately, even though you do live in a rural community, that you still have to lock your doors and pay attention to when strangers are in your neighborhood.
With 2 confirmed homicides and a likely third in as many days, local authorities turned to the FBI for help. Special Agent Peter Christ of the FBI's Canton, Ohio resident agency was assigned the case. To catch up with the suspected spree killer and his companion, they needed an idea of where Eric Elliott might be heading.
So we were trying to get as much background information as we could. We were looking for relatives, uncles, aunts, cousins, friends. We were convinced that they were heading across the country, and we just needed to know everybody that there was a possibility that they would stop and visit, to either visit to say hello or get any kind of financial or moral support.
Can I call you TJ? Yeah, you seem like a nice enough you.
Agents asked one of Eric Elliott's friends to come in for questioning. The friend told them that Elliott had recently become very close to a young ex-convict named Lewis Gilbert. He said that Gilbert and Elliott had spent a lot of time together over the past few weeks. Both had been complaining about how boring life was in the small town and that there was no reason for them to stay. Gilbert was estranged from his wife and son, and Elliott wished to visit his birth mother in California.
I just got out of jail. Hello?
The friend added that the pair mentioned they wanted to do something that would make them go down in history and planned to start by stealing a car.
They mentioned that. We were drinking and got the talk.
The last time he saw them was 5 days ago, when Gilbert and Elliott were walking along railroad tracks behind Mrs. Loader's house.
Kind of strange. Out of the ordinary.
Because Elliott was a troubled teen, Agent Christ believed that he probably looked up to 22-year-old Lewis Gilbert, since Gilbert appeared to do as he pleased.
At the point when Gilbert befriended Elliott, he had been released from jail 2 weeks prior to that. Had a criminal history, had a history of getting in trouble. And at that point, we sort of felt that maybe Mr. Elliott was in awe or enamored with Mr. Gilbert because he did have that kind of criminal history background.
Investigators dug deeper into Lewis Gilbert's past. The 22-year-old had served time for stealing a boat and breaking and entering. He had also been convicted of physically abusing his 3-month-old son. Though agents still lacked concrete evidence that Gilbert and Elliott were traveling together, they needed to find them as soon as possible to prevent any more killing.
Our biggest concern at this point was that we suspected these two of Mrs. Loder's disappearance. They were strong suspects in the killings and the double homicide in Missouri, and we were very concerned that this kind of activity would continue all the way across the country.
Sheriff Wilson's first step was to see if anyone had seen Gilbert with Elliott at the Goshen Dairy store, close to Mrs. Loder's Ohio home. Missouri investigators had found a sandwich wrapper from the store in Mrs. Loder's abandoned vehicle.
Does this look familiar to you?
Yeah. It's one of our wrappers to our sandwich.
The clerk identified the wrapper.
That you sell here at this store?
She also remembered selling the sandwich and some soda to Gilbert and Elliott just after Mrs. Loder disappeared. Authorities now had confirmation the young men were traveling together.
Thank you.
But 5 days had already passed since the spree killers had begun their cross-country rampage. The FBI quickly secured arrest warrants for kidnapping and burglary in the Ruth Loder disappearance. Though agents believed the pair was also responsible for the double homicide in Missouri, authorities still lacked evidence to formally charge them with those crimes. Agents weren't about to wait for someone to call in. Anticipating Gilbert and Elliott's westward movement, the FBI visited Gilbert's mother in Tahlequah, Oklahoma on September 3, 1994. The agent warned her that her son and his friend were armed fugitives, suspected of driving a stolen Oldsmobile with Missouri plates. It was possible that the pair would visit her for help.
I need to know if you've seen them recently.
Oh, they just left this morning.
This morning?
Yes.
The FBI had just missed them. Gilbert and Elliott had arrived at 2 a.m. the previous day. Gilbert claimed the Oldsmobile they were driving belonged to a friend. They said they were headed to California. The pair spent the day and left a few hours before the agent arrived. Cooperating with the FBI, she described the clothes the pair was wearing and gave agents addresses of other relatives. Authorities feared that if they didn't catch up with them soon, the spree killers would strike again.
That was one of the most frustrating things about this whole investigation. It just appeared that we were always a half a day or a day behind them. And that's probably one of the most frustrating things. We just couldn't get ahead of them.
Because Eric Elliott was a minor, investigators needed court permission to distribute his photo. They got the go-ahead 36 hours after the double homicide in Missouri. Lieutenant Daimler added it to the nationwide bulletins for the fugitives.
I was scared to see where they were going to end up next and who they were going to kill next. And I wanted to do everything I could to help get those people off the street, because it was apparent to me that they didn't care who they killed.
Despite the best efforts of authorities, the urgent hunt for the suspected killers stretched into its 6th day. On September 4th, 1994, 165 miles west of Gilbert's mother's house in Oklahoma, a dirt biker was riding the rural trails around Draper Lake, just outside of Oklahoma City. His ride was cut short when he discovered a woman's body amongst the trees. As he raced to summon police, he rode around an Oldsmobile with Missouri plates. Almost a week after Mrs. Loder's abduction in Ohio, the nationwide hunt for 2 suspected killers would continue. By September 4th, 1994, 6 days had elapsed in the FBI's massive nationwide search for a pair of suspected spree killers. Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott were wanted for a possible murder in Ohio and a confirmed double homicide in Missouri. The fugitives were last seen in Oklahoma, heading west. That same day, Oklahoma City police responded to a call from a dirt biker who had discovered a woman's body near Draper Lake. Officers secured the crime scene, then called in homicide detectives. They interviewed the biker who had made the discovery. Homicide Inspector Bob Bemo of the Oklahoma City Police Department was assigned the case.
Once we come upon the immediate scene where the body was located, I observed the young woman to be in a kind of a bent over backwards and caught between a tree.
The victim was a white female in her 30s. Investigators found no identification on or near the body. But a manager at a nearby marina later identified her as his missing employee, Roxy Ruddle.
As a part of our investigation, another vehicle had been found a short distance away from where the victim had been located. And we didn't know if this was a part of the crime or not, although we did secure the area around this vehicle.
When detectives checked the Oldsmobile's Missouri plates with the NCIC, they discovered the car had been reported stolen from the Brewers, the double homicide victims from Missouri. Oklahoma investigators immediately notified authorities back east. To Tuscarawas County Sheriff Walter Wilson in Ohio, it appeared that Gilbert and Elliott had struck again.
They had recovered Missouri's stolen vehicle, and they also had another murder victim. It's just another terrible feeling that's really hard to describe, that obviously this tragedy continues.
Oklahoma police crime technicians gathered evidence from the vehicle. They recovered several unused .22 caliber bullets. A pawn shop receipt from a local Oklahoma City store was also found. Prints lifted from inside and outside the car matched both Gilbert and Elliott's. Oklahoma medical examiners determined that Ruddle's death had occurred in the last day or two, since there was little decomposition. Death had been inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives notified the woman's devastated husband. He informed them that her two-toned pickup truck was also missing. Investigators listed it as stolen and added its information to the growing NCIC report on Gilbert and Elliott. Detectives also took the receipt found in the Brewer's car to the Oklahoma City pawn shop that issued it. 2 video games and a socket wrench set had been pawned the day before the murdered woman was found. They showed the receipt to an employee. He vaguely remembered Gilbert and Elliott, but he had something else that might be stronger than memory. The pawn shop was equipped with a 24-hour surveillance camera. The videotape confirmed his story. September 3rd was the last confirmed sighting of Gilbert and Elliott. The FBI issued 2 more warrants for the suspected killers for unlawful interstate flight. Agent Peter Christ and his team were frustrated that after 6 days, 4 victims, and thousands of man-hours, the killers remained a half day ahead of the FBI.
A lot of things were going through my mind. Number one, we didn't want another double homicide, and we didn't want another killing anyplace. And we were, I guess, what I kept thinking about, what have I not done? What lead have I not sent out? Let me look everything over again to see maybe if we can somehow get ahead of these guys instead of being behind them for a half a day or a day.
The nationwide hunt for Gilbert and Elliott intensified. Law enforcement agencies mobilized additional helicopters to search for Roxy Ruddle's 2-toned pickup truck on routes heading west. Long-haul truck drivers were also notified to report any sightings on the road or at rest stops. Hundreds of calls poured into police in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Ohio.
Going to be a white male, 5'10", approximately 175 pounds.
But none led to the fugitives' immediate whereabouts.
Every time the phone rang, I was very concerned that it would be another body. And that's a terrible feeling when you're working a case like this, when you know what has happened up to that point and what you envision. The worst thing you can envision in your mind would happen is if this thing continued. So every time the phone rang and somebody said it was for me, that was my biggest fear. That was the first thing that came into my mind. Oh, we found another body.
The two suspected spree killers had chosen elderly people and women as their prey. And the FBI didn't know where or whom they would strike next. By September 5th, 1994, after a week of searching, the FBI and local law enforcement were no closer to finding two suspects in a killing spree that spanned 3 states. Agents believe that 22-year-old Lewis Gilbert and 16-year-old Eric Elliott were headed to the home of Elliott's mother in California, driving a stolen 2-tone pickup truck with Oklahoma plates. Missouri Lieutenant Timothy Daimler feared the murder suspects would kill again if they decided to steal another car as they traveled west.
I wasn't thinking serial killer at the time. I guess what was going through my mind at the time that was these guys didn't care who they killed, and I was thinking that we need to catch these people.
News reports and bulletins alerted people in western states that the suspected killers were headed their way, armed and dangerous. In New Mexico, State Police criminal agent Daniel Becker first heard about the fugitives through the media.
My initial thought was that the chances of them being apprehended in New Mexico were extremely slim because of the wide open spaces that we have and a relatively small amount of law enforcement that we have throughout the state.
The same day the reports began to hit the news in New Mexico, Gilbert and Elliott stopped at the rural home of an older couple 15 miles south of Santa Fe. They claimed that the stolen 2-tone pickup truck was low on gas. The couple agreed to help. The fugitives said they were on their way to California, but the woman was suspicious since she didn't see any luggage in the truck. To her, they seemed jumpy and left in a hurry when they heard the noise of nearby construction workers.
State Police Center, this is Carmen.
The woman reported the sighting to the New Mexico State Police. But by the time units arrived to investigate, the two young men were nowhere in sight. The following morning of September 6th, a New Mexico man reported another sighting to police.
How you doing?
He claimed to have seen Gilbert and Elliott the previous night. The man told the officer that he first encountered them while driving on Highway 599 outside Santa Fe. The motorist saw two young hitchhikers and pulled over to pick them up.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for picking us up.
They said their pickup truck had gotten stuck in the mud. He didn't realize who they were until he saw their photos on the news the next morning, describing them as suspected killers.
Wanna know if they can get a ride to the mall.
The witness said he gave the pair a ride to the store where they bought food and gas. Later that night, he saw them again and drove them back to the place they had first met.
Hey, y'all drive safe, man.
It was a desolate part of the highway. The officer needed a landmark to estimate where the motorist had dropped the fugitives. The man said it was close to a small overpass. In the chance that the fugitives were still in the area, he alerted all area law enforcement. The New Mexico State Police were aware they had to move fast. 2 units raced to the location to conduct a search for any trace of the suspected murderers. They found the overpass in a remote area. Reports had warned that the Ohio men were armed. Gilbert and Elliott would be tired and desperate after running and hiding for 7 days with little money. Officers prepared for the worst.
Probably leave contact cover, okay? Once we got him, we'll give you the signal.
If the fugitives were still in the area, they had miles of shrubs and hills behind which they could conceal themselves and take aim at anyone approaching.
Just wait there. Exactly.
Officers were instructed to use extreme caution.
So you guys go on the north side, we're going on the south side, okay? Good luck. You'll get my signal.
The team wanted to bring them back alive. They scanned the dust for footprints, food wrappers, and soda bottles. Anything that might indicate the suspected killers were still in the area. They approached one of 6 culverts underneath the highway. Carefully, they moved forward for a closer look. One officer spotted 2 men lying on the ground inside, apparently sleeping.
Hey, police! Put your hands up! Let me see your hands! Put your hands up! Put your hands up! Come on! Be smart! Put your hands up!
One of the startled men appeared to be groping for his gun in the dark. In the next split second, officers had to decide whether they needed to use deadly force to stop the suspected spree killers. On September 6, 1994, New Mexico State Police were within a few feet of murder suspects Louis Gilbert and Eric Elliott. The fugitives reached for their weapons, but chose not to die. After a murder spree that took the lives of 4 victims in less than a week, the pair was arrested without a struggle. The 1,800-mile chase had ended. FBI Special Agent Peter Christ got the news of their arrest in Ohio.
My reaction, of course, when I received that news was a tremendous sigh of relief. The first thing I wanted to know was, after they'd been caught, were there any bodies, were there any unsolved homicides close to where they were arrested? Of course, the answer was no. Just a tremendous sigh of relief that this whole thing was finally over.
Officers recovered a .22 handgun and a green soda bottle at the campsite where the pair were apprehended. They also found the bedspread belonging to the murdered Mrs. Brewer. State police found Roxy Ruddle's stolen pickup 2 miles away near a racetrack in Santa Fe. Like their other 2 stolen vehicles, the truck was stuck in the mud. Examining fingerprints, crime scene and lab investigators matched personal items to the murdered woman in Oklahoma City. Investigators also found another green soda bottle, the same brand they had found under the culvert and in Ruth Loder's car. Eric Elliott and Louis Gilbert were taken to the New Mexico State Police District Office in Santa Fe. If they could turn one against the other, their prosecution would be assured. 16-year-old Eric Elliott made one phone call to his father in Ohio and refused to say anything about the killings. Now it was Louis Gilbert's turn. The ex-convict waived his rights and agreed to be interviewed. New Mexico State Police criminal agent Daniel Becker had little time to prepare.
Gilbert revealed very little during the first hour of our interview about these killings. A couple times he made mention of, I asked him if he had did this out of, for some justifiable reason, or if he's a cold-blooded killer. And he responded by saying, "One of those."
Gilbert claimed that he didn't recall what had happened over the past 5 days.
Did you murder him?
He refused to say anything about the murders or Mrs. Loader's disappearance. Frustrated, the investigator left the room. A few moments alone was all Gilbert needed.
After we had taken our first break, Gilbert began to open up a little bit more, and he actually made an admission that he had killed between 1 and 5 people. And when I had asked him why he'd killed people, he said, "For stupid reasons."
Gilbert began by recounting the day he met the woman in Oklahoma. He said that he and Elliot struck up a conversation with Roxy Ruddle when they found her fishing alone in a secluded area of Draper Lake near Oklahoma City. They told her that their car was stuck in the mud and needed a ride back to town. She offered to help and packed up her gear. Her pickup truck was parked just up the hill.
Give me the keys. Now, come on, quick. Tie her up.
When her back was turned, Gilbert pulled the .22 pistol Elliot had taken from his parents' Ohio home. Then Gilbert told Elliot to tie Ruddle's hands. Gilbert said Ruddle cried and asked them not to hurt her. Elliot stayed behind while Gilbert marched Ruddle into the woods. He told her to sit down at the base of a tree. Then he shot Roxy Ruddle. Now that Gilbert had admitted to one murder, the agent pressed him on the others. He asked the confessed killer to describe what had happened in Missouri the day before he got to Oklahoma.
Gilbert advised me that they had been traveling through the state of Missouri, and the evening before the murders, they had parked the stolen vehicle that they had obtained in Ohio in what I was led to believe was a field. And they'd slept in the vehicle overnight, and the following morning or afternoon when they were about to leave, they realized the vehicle was stuck. So they needed to get another vehicle.
As Missouri investigators believed, Gilbert and Elliot had simply walked to the closest house and saw a car in the driveway. It was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Brewer. Gilbert decided they'd ask to use the phone to call for a tow.
Hello, sir. How you doing? Oh, pretty good. We got our car. Thank you so much.
Wanting to help, the Brewers let the young men in.
Once inside, they learned that they didn't have a telephone book, so they couldn't come up with a number to call for a wrecker. And it's at that point that Gilbert told me that he decided, or they decided, that they were going to kill the Brewers.
Come on, move it.
They led the grandfather and grandmother into the basement.
Back to me. Keep going.
Then executed them. There was one more crime that Gilbert had not discussed.
We're walking down some railroad tracks.
The elderly cancer patient from Ohio, Mrs. Loader, was still missing and presumed dead.
See if we can get the keys for it.
No one knew what had become of her. On the evening of August 29, 1994, Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott approached Mrs. Loader's Port Washington home to steal her car. Since no one answered when they knocked, they believed the house was empty.
Stick it in. Cheap house. Stick it in.
So they broke in to search for the car keys.
This old lady.
After 10 minutes, they still hadn't found the keys. As they rummaged through the living room, they were startled when Mrs. Loader suddenly appeared. He claimed Mrs. Loader was still alive when he locked her in the trunk of her car and sped off.
They got about 4 miles outside of town in a wooded area, and they pulled up alongside of a guardrail and parked, got outside. Gilbert told me that he opened the trunk and he picked up Mrs. Loader out of the trunk, and they took her off the road near the guardrail, about 5 feet from the side of the road.
Gilbert said he forced Mrs. Loader to walk away from the car. He said he shot her with the same .22 that had killed the others.
We drove a little ways and
Gilbert had finished his description of the murders. But he hadn't told the agent where they could find the murdered Ohio woman.
We knew it was crucial to find Mrs. Loader's body, both as evidence so this murder could be prosecuted, and also just simply as closure for the family so that they could find her and make for proper arrangements for a funeral.
Gilbert gave authorities directions to find Mrs. Loader's remains. 50 people from the FBI and 12 different law enforcement and volunteer groups followed Gilbert's directions. They searched for the dead woman in fields and woods and hills for days. But the 79-year-old widow and mother of 4 was never found. Sheriff Walter Wilson continues to work the open case.
When you work a murder case, you almost become part of a family, so to speak, because your goal obviously is to solve the crime, to help the victims, the surviving victims, as much as you possibly can. It's something obviously that will never ever be forgotten. I have a high respect for the Loader family, having got to know them very well. I feel bad to this day that we've not yet been able to recover Mrs. Loader's remains.
16-year-old Eric Elliott stood trial as an adult in Oklahoma. Elliott was found guilty of first-degree murder for his participation in the killing of Roxy Ruddle. He was sentenced to life without parole. In Missouri, after 57 years of marriage, the Brewers were laid to rest. Unlike the family of Ruth Loader, the Brewer family was able to have some closure for their tragic loss. After being sentenced to death for the murder of Roxy Ruddle in Oklahoma, Lewis Gilbert was extradited to Missouri, where he stood trial for the murders of William and Flossie Brewer.
Lewis, where's Ruth? Where's the lady in Ohio? Where's Ruth, Lewis? Give her family a break.
He remained silent on the whereabouts of Ruth Loader's remains. Since the Ohio woman has not yet been recovered, there has been no trial date set to answer for her kidnapping and murder. For her family and friends, Gilbert and Elliott's actions are unconscionable.
I've often thought what goes through their mind or what causes them to do that, and I really, it's hard to understand or think what they're thinking, other than obviously they have to be very evil people.